Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Hartglass, and you are listening to It's All About Food. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have been doing this podcast, It's All About Food, on the Progressive Radio Network since 2009. That's like 16 years. And we've covered the gamut with food. We've talked about delicious food and healthy food and food for kids and recipes and parties and socializing with food, all of these wonderful things connected to food. And we talked about more serious things, the health related to food and the impact on our environment. And of course, what is most important to me is cruelty to animals, pain and suffering. And we talked about policy and politics. There's just so many things that are connected to food. Today, we're going to get really serious because what's going on is very urgent, the things that are happening today. And I think we're going to connect some very dark dots with food to fascism. And to do that, there's only one person that I could think of, and that's Will Potter. And I spoke with Will back in 2014, I think it was 11 years ago, when he came out with his Green is the New Red, an insider's account of the social movement under siege book. Blew me away. Will, let's just jump right in. Thank you for taking the time for joining me. We are going to be talking about your new book, Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Table. And before you say anything else, I'm going to be repeating this throughout the program. Buy this book, everyone. Buy this book. Buy this book. Now, I often recommend books. Not here. I'm telling you, buy the book and read it and share it. This is so important. And I'm including a post for this podcast on how you can get it. You can also go to willpotter.com. Will, I'm taking a breath and welcome.
Wonderful to talk to you again, Karen. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for having me back on. I'm happy to talk to you.
You are a very brave individual. Very brave, very smart. And I'm glad you're on the planet, and I wish there were a lot more people like you who have courage.
Oh, that means the world to me. Thank you.
And I wonder, how are you? Before we get into all of your research, I really wonder how you are, because your work is so difficult, and how are you taking care of yourself?
No, I appreciate you asking that. And I would be curious about the same for you and for folks listening right now. I feel like we're all, if we're paying attention to the world, I think we kind of know the answer to that question. I think it's just an onslaught right
Yeah.
now. Um, I've been increasingly open about kind of the toll a lot of this work has taken over the last, 25 years, depression and PTSD and, all the things you
Yeah.
could imagine. And um, all that being said, I think I'm just feeling urgency. I'm feeling drive and a bit of fear, anxiety, as you can imagine, both about the state of the country and global trends, and also trying to navigate this personally. That was a big part of the book that I'm sure we'll talk about. I was lucky to have the help of groups like Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. They set me up with a team of lawyers beforehand as we're talking about risk. And that's really a big theme in the book. The risks and dangers of telling the truth. And I think ultimately, I'm just kind of feeling a fire in me that I've felt my entire career, but all of these issues are coming to a head. And now's the time for us to, and why I'm so grateful to be on a show like this, to take a hard look at it and to talk about moving forward.
So in my life, I juggle a number of things. I'm a singer, and I have this wonderful podcast. I started another podcast in French last year because I don't know, I'm nuts. And also, I do some work consulting for people, vetting different programs that are promoting healthy diets, because I'm kind of obsessed with healthy food. And while I was reading your book, I took a break to do some of my other work. And I just took out a little thing that I thought would be important in terms of all of us taking care of ourselves. And I'm looking for the quote. Okay. Oh, here it is. Okay. So I'm vetting a program on aging, and it says recent research suggests that chronic stress can increase your risk of heart disease by as much as 40 to 60%. Sleep deprivation, now considered a public health crisis, is closely tied to hypertension, systemic inflammation, and cardiovascular events. That's why I asked you how you are, and everyone else. We're all reading current events, and it's like domino effect. So everybody breathe. Breathing is just such a wonderful thing. There are so many wonderful breathing exercises because we need you, Will, and we need everybody that's working to make this world a better place.
Absolutely.
And what I normally do when I read a book is I open a text file and I take notes with the page numbers of things that pop out that are new to me or important to me, things that I want to highlight. With your book, I practically copied the whole book.
I'm happy to hear that.
There's
It
just
covers a lot of ground, I
there's
have to
just too
say.
many things to talk about. And you said in your book that you left so much out.
This started, this book has taken a lot of different forms. It's been a 10-year journey. And at one point, it was an attempt at an ebook. And then at another point, it was a 3-book series. And I've arrived at this. So there were a lot of difficult cuts and things left on the cutting room floor. And it's a really multidisciplinary approach. It's part investigative journalism, it's archival research, it's memoir. It's like you said in the introduction, an attempt to kind of connect the dots between a lot of different fields of study also.
So the title, let's start with the title, Little Red Barns. And in your preface, you talked about the Fisher-Price barn. And I want you to know that was an important plaything. I'm 9 years older than my brother, and I spent a lot of time with him when he was really little, watching him. I think my parents really appreciated it because I was doing things that maybe they didn't want to spend time with. He was the youngest of 3. Anyway, I loved his Fisher-Price barn. And the door, when you would open it, would go moo.
Right.
But there's something kind of sinister in the little red barn, and that's what your book is all about.
We all know what a farm looks like, and it really starts there, right? It starts in the picture books and the play sets and the songs and all of these things that whether we realize it or not, and well, I should say we don't realize it because at that age, we don't understand what a story is, even. We're just being cultured into this narrative, and it's a story that follows us for the rest of our lives, and product labels and brand names and the food we eat and advertisements. And the sinister element that you mentioned is that I realized this is also a narrative. It's the same narrative that's being used to push authoritarian message, a far right message that we're seeing right now. And so that the book is really the path that resulted in me seeing the story and seeing the connections between those stories and how they're ultimately used as a form of social control.
When I spoke with you 11 years ago, you said, with everything going on right now, I think most people aren't really aware of the scope of what's taking place, especially against protesters and against our basic rights right now. That was 11 years ago. Right?
It's a little, yeah, it's a little surreal. And I hesitate, Karen, because it's like I'm still kind of processing this right now. Like I feel like I've been a broken record. I've been trying to make really the same consistent warning my entire adult life. And in the last few years, things have accelerated so quickly that in some ways I'm proud of those warnings, but they also feel like not enough. And I kind of struggle and hesitate a little bit to bring that message up to the current environment because I think things have spun in a completely like parallel dimension right now. I
Yeah.
mean, the attacks that we talked about with my first book against protest and civil disobedience and investigation have really now become a global playbook that have been used against other social movements and have spread around the world.
I want to dig into so many things, but just a light one. I remember you mentioned Eddie Lama, and I live in New York,
Yeah.
and I remember him. I don't know what happened to him, but I remember him some 20 years ago with his van and his videos and the great work that he did. And he spoke at a lot of events that I went to.
Yeah, for folks that don't know or weren't exposed, Eddie Lama and others really were pioneering these creative ways of showing people video footage of what happens every day on factory farms. And Eddie in particular made a van setup where he would drive and park in the streets of New York City and have the video on the side of the van, and passerbys would just see it and often kind of burst into tears.
Yeah.
And that was an important part of the book because I talk about how these movements have really experimented with different ways of trying to bear witness and make people see. And then a shift in technology and journalism and culture really escalated and changed all of that and kind of set the stage for what I talk about in the book of a new wave of undercover investigations and video footage that kind of changed everything and led to a backlash and labels of terrorism by the industry.
Bearing witness is an important theme in your book. And you talked about how it drove you, and then you were questioning if that was the right approach, and then you came back to it again. Just briefly, why is bearing witness so important?
You know, this is an idea that is most often linked to journalism and also religious faith, right? This idea of the foundational confrontation with darkness, with injustice, even with evil, is to see it and to refuse to turn away. And as a journalist, I've put this kind of unwavering faith in this idea that that's my job to go to these places, to see, to tell the story. And I have to have a faith as a journalist that if others see it, then they will respond and we can make change. And now in this digital era where we're all just so bombarded with images and footage of just everything horrible in the world, that's part of why I was really questioning and struggling with it throughout the course of this journey. But like you said, I finally came back to it and kind of started to rethink it in some ways and recommit myself, I should say, to this practice of bearing witness.
It's so important. And what you've done is so important. And like I said before, you've been very brave. So you share many, many stories in the book. People must read these. I said before, buy the book. I'm saying it again now, buy the book. If you haven't gone to willpotter.com yet and scroll down where the book is, there's a yellow box. It takes you to City Light Books, and it puts it right in the cart for you. It's very easy. All you have to do is pop in your address and credit card and buy the book. Okay, do you get my message? Buy the book. Also, I just want to plug City Light Books. They're like my favorite bookstore, independent bookstore with a phenomenal history. And they're in San Francisco. And if you're in San Francisco, just go there and feel the ghosts while you're walking through
Absolutely.
the bookstore. You have seen what we call factory farms, animal agriculture. You've been in places where there's so much shit, and we want to call it shit, merde, crap, excrement, animal manure. I like saying manure, like a New Yorker. Manure. That there's no place for it. You can't pile it up high enough. You can't, there's so much leaching out of these lagoons. They spray it in the air. And you talk about your experience. You have asthma, how it burned your eyes. You've smelled it. How can you share that horror with us?
It was, you know, it connects to that idea of bearing witness. You see I've been to the factory farms, to slaughterhouse floors, to the kill floors, to the communities, to talking to farm workers and immigrants and journalists and I've just exposed myself to every component, and I found myself really struggling to put words to that. The way I talk about it in the book, and the reason I take kind of a personal approach is because I want to show that this is being filtered through my lived experience. There's certainly other ways of viewing some of these things, but it was really transformational to me to not just see this on a computer screen or in a scientific journal article, but I went out to these communities where people are being forced out of their homes and are choosing to leave the community because it's not livable anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had understood practices in factory farming of the manure lagoons and how waste is aerated and sprayed with giant sprinklers over the fields. That's a very different thing, though, than being there in person and going around with a longtime resident who is heartbroken and seeing what has happened to this kind of romantic farm community that was overrun by the industry. And the way I kind of talk about in the book, I also share that I came home from those trips, and because of my asthma and also the stress, like you mentioned before, and all these things, I was sick for weeks. And so I couldn't imagine living there. It made me think of being a little boy in rural Texas, and I would have asthma attacks. My family had hogs and horses and chickens and all that. And I just can't imagine, like, what if you don't have an inhaler? What if you don't have health care? What if you're not documented? What if you don't have access to any of these things? It really helped me to understand this in a much different way. I had to go there for myself.
When you talk about that experience, I'm reading it and I have a big knot in my stomach. And it's not just about animals, which is horrific. This is also about humans. It's also about all life in that area that are exposed
Mhm.
to manure in a way that our Earth, isn't set up to manage. And nature is brilliant. Nature takes manure. Nature takes excrement in a natural way and turns it back into the earth, fertilizer, and all kinds of wonderful nutrients. And there's all kinds of wonderful insects and animals that are able to take this product and recycle it in a beautiful way. But when we're making, I don't know how many, I can't even imagine the quantities, they're insane. Nature can't handle it. And the effect is just so devastating.
And that's a point I think to really emphasize that we forget. Go back to that storybook farm. Think of the little red barn, the animals walking in the fields. They're eating, they're pooping, they're rolling around as their waste dissipates into the earth. Like you said, it's used. The natural world is inherently efficient and beautiful, and like the processes of how all this works. When you confine thousands of animals on concrete and in sheds, that system is completely disrupted. And so what happens is that waste has to go someplace. And that's where all of the industrial machinery and the waste lagoons and the sprinklers and all of this comes into play. It will burn out cropland. It will leads to skyrocketing asthma and lung disease and other health problems in the community. In addition to that, there's just nowhere for it to go. Some factory farms can produce as much waste as in the entire human population of major cities like Boston and New York. I mean, this is just an ungodly amount of waste being produced, and there's nowhere for it to go. So the environmental impact is not just extreme, but it's concentrated in these areas. And that's what really causes the most significant impacts for water, air, land, and also towards climate change as well.
We've covered this topic numerous times in the 16 years that I've been doing this podcast, and I know a lot of my listeners know about it. It's a terrible thing. But what makes that knot in my stomach get bigger and bigger and bigger is when residents talk about it, when residents go to their politicians, to their representatives in local government, when activists go to the leaders in their community, they are treated in ways that are unbelievable. They are shot down. Sometimes they are terrorized, and then they're called terrorists.
And and that dynamic is one that I really had to confront, and it challenged me in this book, because I think it's easy to create narratives both as activists and in the farm community and in the industry of who are your people and who the opposition is. And a lot of those narratives are false, because the people that are in these farm communities, I think, have much more in common than the environmental activists or the animal activists than they do with the industry. And the industry is telling them that unless they consolidate and turn into these industrial operations and allow the industry to come in, that these extremist, terrorist, wacky, hippie, whatever pejorative they use, right? This opposition is going to destroy their community. And it's just false. The industry is the one that's leading that destruction. And I think there's a real potential here to, even though there are some important differences between all these different groups, to realize the common threat. And I think that's what we have to focus on. The common threat is industrial agriculture. It's destroying the communities, the small farms, it's harming the animals in just unbelievable ways, the environment, workers. We're all united in this, and we need to see past these false narratives.
I read 1984 when I was young.
Yeah. Didn't
And
know it was nonfiction, did you?
it's it's a dystopian story, and it's here. It's here where a government or certain people in government are rewriting narratives that are just fake, and people believe them.
And that's quite literally what's happening. And to underscore that point, I found it repeatedly in my work. They're rewriting by censoring and removing government and scientific data. They are rewriting history books and textbooks. They're rewriting by outlawing and criminalizing journalism and investigations. These are tactics that have been historically used by authoritarians to control populations, to rewrite history, rewrite the present, and if you can control those two things, you can rewrite the future as well.
Now, these things have been going on for a long, long, long time. And I want to think that things have gotten better. And in many ways, things have gotten better. And in some ways, the things that we're seeing with our current government here in the United States is that they are trying to go backwards on so many advances we have made. The world is nowhere near perfect, but we have been making progress, and now we seem to be going backwards. And it's really very difficult to handle that. I'm thinking of Henrik Ibsen's play, Enemy of the People, which played on Broadway last year. It's from 1882. He was a Norwegian playwright, wrote this play about a community that had a contaminated lake that people were getting sick in. There was a doctor who wanted to inform the people, but his brother didn't want to because it would affect the profits of the town. It would affect so many things that were connected to power and money, and he didn't want that information exposed. And that was 1882. And we have this now where there's so much denial about water pollution, air pollution, soil erosion. Can't even say climate change in Florida, right? They wrote it out of all of their text. What is this and how? Well, I'm not expecting you to have any answers. What you have done for us is you've bared witness and you're testifying, and we thank you for that. But I am groping for straws.
Well, and I'm grasping for him too. I think a couple things come to mind with that. Is one, that backlash is a direct response to all of that progress that's been made. You know, if you think in the history of social movements, which is kind of what my work has really been focused on, in the last 75 years, I mean, this is massive cultural change. And the backlash is a reactionary one that is using this image of the Little Red Barn and these stories to pitch people this romantic, idealized past where everything was simple and straightforward, and we understood what it meant to be a man and a woman and a family, and all of our lives were idyllic, just like that Little Red Barn. That's what all this Make America Great Again nonsense is. It's all trying to tap into our current fears as we become aware of how the world is changing and how kind of bad it still is in a lot of ways, and promising us this false bill of goods. It's a snake oil pitch that we can go back to this romantic past that never really existed. So that's one part we have to keep in mind. And the other part, and I don't know if people will like this answer, but I think it needs to be said, is that I think that's always the battle. That
Mm.
this isn't going to go away. For all the progress we make, there will be those reactionary forces. There will be those attempts to pull us backwards, to push us into darkness, to hide it, to censor and disrupt and imprison. But at the same time, I think we have to see that with kind of a grain of salt of the reason they're doing that, I think, is a testament to how effective these movements have been. I mean, I think some of these folks, these authoritarian movements, are really terrified of that. Um, and so they're attempting to disrupt and censor to silence that story because they know they can't win with their own.
You mentioned the Food and Agriculture Organization, their groundbreaking report in 2006, Livestock Long Shadow. I remember reading it and we were all cheering about it, so excited. And I've had conversations with Robert Goodland and Jeff Enhang, who contributed and wrote a response based on that report, saying that the amount of greenhouse gas emitted by livestock was actually much larger. But the point was the FAO had put this concept on the map, which was brilliant. Nobody was really talking about it before. And just like you mentioned before, as we make strides, there's pushback. And there was tremendous pushback against that report. And a lot of money went into pushing back and rewriting the narrative.
The industry flipped out. They, I mean, and we're still seeing, just recently, there's been more documents and more evidence that's come out of just how much they freaked out about this. And so to bring your reader or listeners up to speed, this was a landmark report, like you said. A lot of folks think it didn't go nearly far enough in
Mhm.
describing the environmental and climate impact of animal agriculture, but still it was important because this discussion really wasn't taking place. But the industry saw that as such a threat that they did things like significantly ramp up their lobbying operations. They started pushing for alternate or even fake information as well. They were pushing the industry and kind of harassing scientists to roll back some of their assessments. They started bankrolling individual academics. And if all of this sounds like things that the oil and gas industry has done for the last 4 to 6, you would be correct. It's the exact same playbook. They were really copying everything that big oil did because remember, the oil industry knew all about climate change and they lied and manipulated and censored information and propped up fake research for decades to try to minimize their responsibility. And that's exactly what the ag industry is doing as well. Now, it's kind of shifting a little bit because, in addition to those heavy handed tactics, they're doing things like just straight up greenwashing. There's this idea of like climate friendly beef, and they're using it as a marketing gimmick. And all this stuff is being fought in court, I should say successfully.
Mm.
But that isn't slowing it down. You know, the industry is seeing the writing on the wall, just like we have peak oil, we are reaching peak beef, peak animal products, that this system isn't sustainable and is kind of the last gasp of what I think is an industry that is either going to have to change or go extinct.
I was listening to NPR the other day. Somebody was talking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and had Marion Nessel on to make some
Mhm.
comments. And one of the things that she said, or when he was asking her for some sort of like, where do we go with all this? And she basically said, get money out of politics.
Yep.
Would that do it? If we got the money out of politics,
Boy, that would be a good start.
wouldn't it?
I mean, after living and reporting in Washington, D.C. for so many years, one thing you learn real quickly is you can't talk about anything political without talking about money. And what I found going deep in this book is that these industries the ag industry are contributing in an outsized way compared to their scale. In other words, they are a huge influence on the political process, but the way that they're spending money on lobbying, on politicians, on legislation, is really even disproportionate to that. So if we could have some restrictions on how corporate money is being used, that would certainly be a great start. But I think we also need to, roll back some of these restrictions and censorship that's taking place. It's really an attack on all fronts about consumers' right to know where their food comes from, and really an increasing demand for sustainable food options.
Censorship is a big word. It's serious. And we're seeing more of it now. But you talk about, well, one of the things that really was surprising to me was how animal activists, you said animal and environmental activists are like seen as something completely different from the rest of our culture, and that very few people want to support our work. There's a big disconnect there, and that has enabled the corporations to kind of twist the narrative and make animal activists and environmental activists like the bad guy.
Yeah.
I can't wrap my head around that.
I've struggled with it quite a lot over
And
these years.
environmental activists, I've it surprised me that they're in the same bucket, because for a long time the animal activists wanted to get the environmental activists on board about reducing meat consumption, because we knew what a tremendous impact it had on the environment, and that's slowly happening.
It is. And I think, to kind of use that farm analogy, there are a lot of silos in social movements and in our culture. We're increasingly split off into these silos where we're separated from each other. And part of that is the nature of social change, right? It takes time and work to expand our empathy and consciousness to other issues and to non-human animals in the natural world. But then also part of that is this has been part of the playbook by industry and the FBI to really message and drive this message home that, hey, these animal people, these environmental people, they're not like the rest of the progressive movement. They're not like these legitimate civil rights activists, keeping in mind that it wasn't very many years ago that the FBI was infiltrating and trying to destroy those legitimate civil rights activists like they are today as well. But that's been the message, and I think social movements have bought into it to a degree. I think there's also some difficulty inherent in the topics we're talking about. This is when you're talking about animal protection, this is a social movement different from the rest, and that humans are not at the center. Um, and the people, or I should say, the victims who are suffering most from the injustice are not able to speak in their own defense. And other humans are not able to see themselves in those victims, right? That's what Dr. King and Gandhi and all the icons of social struggles we think about, that's what they were doing with civil disobedience. They were hoping that other people would see them suffering and understand that that suffering is shared and have that empathy. And it's different talking about animals and talking about the natural world. And I think, you know, I know that's not really a straightforward answer, but it's messy. There are all these
Mm.
different pieces. And what I tried to do in the book is to identify a path forward where, yes, this is messy, but we can see and expand our empathy and our awareness in ways that it doesn't mean we have to stop seeing human rights abuses, because there are plenty right now. And it doesn't mean that seeing human rights abuses means we can't also see the environment and what's happening to animals. And that's where that bearing witness comes in. We have to remember, and I really believe we are strong enough to see all of it. And it's a mess and it's dark and it's overwhelming, but we have to see it all because these issues are so interconnected that like we can't solve them if we're just have our eyes on one of those silos on the farm. You know, we have to open all those barn doors.
While I was reading your book, I got a text from a friend of mine who's vegan, and she was driving along and she wrote, "Can you help me understand why a trucker and several other motorists on the highway this morning stopped dead in their tracks, causing massive congestion to avoid hitting a family of ducks, when I am sure that all of them eat foie gras and cooked duck?"
That's the heart of it, right?
Denial.
Well, and
It's almost like a human defense mechanism. Denial.
oh, 100% is. And also, there's an issue of scale that I struggled with in the
Mm.
book. That if we can get our image or our eyesight down to that family of ducks, we can see them and we can understand and empathize. But when you start talking about 9 billion animals every year, just in the United States, just in the food system, I don't think we can handle numbers like that as human beings. And like when we're talking about the climate crisis, the scale of the problem is so enormous that I think it starts to shut down a part of our brain. And I don't think it's, you know, there's also some biases and maybe we don't want to look, we don't want to know where our food comes from, things like that. But I think the scale is a big part of it. Like it's just so hard to process that level of suffering and
Mm.
injustice, and it's hard to sit with that.
A lot of people use the expression glass walls, that if we could
Mhm.
see inside, it would make a difference. And in some ways, I think it would. But in some ways, I don't know. There are a lot of people, I don't want to know about it, you know?
And that's an important kind of turning point for me in Little Red Barns was I put so much faith in that as a journalist that all we have to do if we make people see, if we expose, it's enough. And I realized that that's part of our understanding is seeing. Another key part of it is kind of breaking down the stories that make sense of what we're seeing. And unless we do that, I don't know if we can reach people with images alone. Because at this point, you know, we can doom scroll on our phones all day and
Mm-hmm.
watch nothing but nasty footage, right? And some people, like me, you know, when I was young, the book opens with some of the first video footage I ever saw. So for some of us, that really hits and that really changes us. And then I think for others, we need more.
Mm.
And I think this journey of the book really complicated those feelings for me of how do we make people see. In part, it's the images, and in part, I think we have to start unpacking the stories that are keeping us in the dark.
So I'm reading your book, and at page 155, it made me cry because
Mm.
it was good. You wrote, "It's not often in my line of work that I have good news to report, so please read these next few sections slowly and savor them because, believe it or not, we actually started winning." And I did. I took a moment. I'm like, Oh, good. I-
Be a little breather. Yeah.
yeah, right? But it's all about connecting and cooperating and aligning with other groups and finding things that we can all agree on.
And that was so that portion of Little Red Barns is talking about how groups came together to fight ag gag censorship laws that were making it illegal to take photos of farms and calling it terrorism. And it was a transformational experience for me. I was reporting on this, obviously, and speaking about it and really just kind of throwing myself into this fight. But behind the scenes, I also had a vantage point of seeing these coalitions come together. And we were talking about those silos before, and those silos started to break down quite a bit. All of a sudden, I was a plaintiff in lawsuits challenging these ag gag laws in court, and we had supporting briefs from a whole host of news organizations. There were other briefs from environmental, food safety, workers' rights, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, just a really wide cross section of society. You had groups that were working on domestic violence, veterans' rights, childcare. Everyone was understanding that, well, if we let the industry start carving out special protections that make it illegal to see what they're doing, what other industry doesn't want that power grab? And that was such a key moment that I think as working behind the scenes, I saw that we got past this point of saying, well, you need to go vegan or vegetarian, and well, all this kind of purity politics that we can do in social movements, and instead say, what is uniting us? And what's uniting us is this is industry trying to create a pathway to keep themselves hidden from opposition and from journalists and protest. And that was enough to really unite a wide cross section of society. And it was just, it was truly beautiful to see. I mean, it gives me chills even when I was working on that section of the book, because, you don't get a lot of wins in this work these days. And so to have everybody kind of rally together, I'm admittedly a big nerd, but it felt like like Lord of the Rings, when all of the different communities of Middle Earth are, it's the trees and the hobbits and the elves and the orcs. And that's kind of how it felt, like all these different social
Right.
movements,
Well,
stepping up to the fight together.
that's what we need to do. And there are those sayings, first they came for so and so and I did
Yeah.
nothing, and then they came for so and so, blah blah blah, and I did nothing, and then they came for me. Uh-oh. And people need to feel more pain before they react,
And I
unless
hope
they
that's
make
what,
that realization that if they're doing it to them, they might do it to us.
and I hope that's something people understand about this book. I'm approaching this from a certain point of view, and I make my views clear. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if you're vegetarian or vegan or environmentalist or what your politics are. This is very much a canary in the coal mine situation. And the tactics that have been used to try to silence animal rights and environmental activists for decades, in particular, these new attempts to criminalize information, are really the playbook that whatever issue you're most passionate about, it's going to come home to roost. It's going to come knocking on your door. And I think that's how we start uniting around this.
You talked about ACLU
Mhm.
and Southern Poverty Law Center, and how they're not that supportive of animal activists. I was very sad to see that, because I support them.
I do too. I mean, I worked at the ACLU legislative office a number of years on Patriot Act stuff. And so I say that both to, in the spirit of moving forward, right?
Mm.
That I do think ACLU and some of these other groups kind of dropped the ball on these attempts, or these not just attempts, but these longstanding efforts to label animal rights activists as terrorists. But that's also starting to change. Around AgGag, some of the ACLU affiliates really came out swinging hard, human rights and civil rights groups. But I still struggled with it in the book because I think if this playbook were being used against any other human-centered cause, these would be the groups that would be on the front lines. And so I still wrestle with that. I think there needs to be even more ramping up of those efforts to see that what's happening to animal rights activists is part of this broader ecosystem, this broader war on dissent. And especially as authoritarianism rises here in the US and abroad, we need to connect the dots.
You talked about the FBI and how they seem to be more interested and spend a lot more energy and resources on looking for trouble with animal activists rather than with neo-Nazi white supremacists. That gave me pause. And I'm wondering, as our federal government is being ripped apart and institutions are being shuttered and people are being fired and laid off, do we like the FBI? Do we need them?
You might know where I land on that question. I think so. I'll say this as both a journalist and as a scholar, the history of the FBI from day one has been an institution to control and neutralize social movements. It has been on the wrong side of everything that we view
Wow.
now as heroes. I mean, this is the FBI that tried to get Dr. Martin Luther King to kill himself, that disrupted civil rights and anti-war groups, that was spreading false. I mean, the history is so deep. But the important thing, I think, for this book is to realize as we're seeing all of this far right violence just spike through the roof, this was the same period that the FBI was relentlessly saying their number one domestic terrorism threat, that's their language, number one, was the animal rights and environmental movements. And in my research, I found that the FBI was warned repeatedly by its own inspector general's office, by the US government itself, that it needed to change its priorities or it's going to allow violent groups to continue to grow. And that's exactly what we've seen happen. So flash forward now to 2025 that we have some of these folks, we've seen them in January 6th. Now they're in the Capitol, they're in the White House, the militia groups are growing, white supremacists and neo-Nazis are marching through the streets of America. The FBI had a role in this. And I think if it were a different administration, you'd hear me calling for congressional hearings, just like we had in the 1970s, the Church Commission, to have oversight and accountability of what the hell the FBI was thinking and how it put lives and our democracy at risk. But I don't think we're going to see those hearings anytime soon. So instead, I'll say that, yeah, I think if you care about social justice, the FBI is not your friend.
Wow. Everyone, if you haven't bought the book yet, maybe you're waiting for the end of this podcast, but I know you can do two things at once. Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable. I know some of you are listening later in time when you download the podcast and you're not listening live, but whatever you do, get the book. Fascism.
Another light topic we'll add
Light
to the mix,
topic.
Kara.
I had
Just keep it
mentioned in the
breezy.
beginning, we're going to connect food to fascism. I'm going to give a definition because I think some people aren't quite sure what fascism is.
I think so too.
Fascism is a far-right political ideology characterized by authoritarianism, extreme nationalism, and the suppression of political opposition, often led by a dictatorial leader. It emphasizes the subordination of individual interests to the perceived good of the nation or race, and typically involves strong state control over society and the economy. Did you want to add anything else to that, Will?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. And I would also put a little asterisk there that you can call this fascism, we can call it authoritarianism, we can call it something else. And I think what's important is we not obsess too much about whether this is the same as 1930s Germany or Italy or Turkey today or Philippines or any other country that's going on this path. The key, I think, is to see these shared trends, which is consolidating state power in the name of this nation state, in the name of white people, traditional, so-called traditional values, and at the expense of everybody else. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen at a frantically accelerating pace right now.
Yes, we are. Okay. Well, Will, we're almost at the end of this program, and I'm wondering, is there anything that I didn't mention that you would really like to talk about? Because there's so much to talk about, and I barely touched the surface of all the notes that I made.
I think it would be maybe to elaborate on that last point. I know there's a lot of both fear right now as we're watching what's happening in the US. And I think we're all kind of in what feels like a bit of a freeze state of not quite sure what to do, especially when we start dropping the F bomb like that. Like it feels so huge, right? It's hard to know, well, what do we do in response to that? And I don't think I'm the person to guide that, but I think I've learned a lot from this book and from my life in these movements and in journalism. And what I will say is that as we're seeing this power grab and this authoritarianism unfold, the best response to that is to build community, to recognize what we have in common with our neighbors, the people next to us, the social movements next to us. And I think this is a moment where we have to see past a lot of the differences that can really paralyze social movements and paralyze ourselves. We get lost in those silos, like I said, and now is a time that we have to have, you know, I make a lot of, I spend a lot of time on motorcycles to kind of clear my brain. And one of the lessons you learn really early on is you have to keep your eyes up. Because if your eyes are down, you're looking at the spot that you've already hit on the bike in the road by the time you're there, right? So you have to lift up your eyes. And I think that's what we have to do right now. We have to lift up our eyesight, kind of expand our field of vision, and start recognizing um, we need to build some perhaps unlikely coalitions. We need to really double down on community, connecting with friends and family and allies that share the same fears and the same concerns we have. And I think for folks listening to this show, if you care deeply about animal issues and food issues and the environment, I would encourage you to move in these other communities with a degree of humility, right? Be willing to listen and to learn, stand your ground and say what you believe, but try to have a spirit of collaborating because that's what we need right now. And I think that's what these people in power are truly terrified of. Um, Having animal rights and environmental and civil rights activists and artists and professors and journalists. If you start listing all the groups that are in the direct crosshairs of fascists right now, and we had even a fraction of them on the same page, that's a dangerous force to be reckoned with. And I hope we can start cultivating that more in the US.
Well done. I'm just thinking there are many people who are suffering financially and have all kinds of issues. Maybe they're people of color, maybe they're immigrants, maybe they have family who are undocumented. And then there are those of us who have a nice life. I'm not a rich person. I don't make a lot of money, but I am comfortable. I have a roof over my head. I eat organic food. My belly is always satisfied. I'm surrounded by love, by family and friends. I'm grateful. And for many people, living like that is not enough motivation to
Mm.
want to look up.
There's even a temptation to just protect that what we have, that safety that
Yeah.
we have. And instead, I think can be a moment to really, that's a powerful thing that you just shared, to recognize that privilege that we have,
Mm.
and instead use it as a starting point to open ourselves up, to bear witness, to see how others are suffering, and to see what role we can play in making a difference in that.
Will, thank you so much for writing Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable. I don't know what toll that took on your life the last decade, but I think it was worth it to
Thank
put
you
it
so
out
much,
there.
Karen. I appreciate it.
And I'm not sure what's next for you. I hope you're taking it easy.
I'm off to a writing residency next week. I'm already working on the next book, which
Oh,
is kind of a radically different. It's more of solution oriented.
oh,
So if
good.
folks are interested, you can sign up on my website, willpotter.com. There's an email list, and I'll be sharing news about this new project I'm working on.
Yeah, we need solutions. And I'm not sure when you finished writing this book, but you mentioned towards the end, you just can't keep up with what's going on every
No,
day.
you
And
really
so,
can't.
but it's all still very important and all very current. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
so
much
much,
for joining
Karen.
me. Yep.
It was great talking to you. Thank you
Okay,
for
be
having me
well. And
on.
I wish you great success with this book and hope it starts a bigger movement.
Thank you. I hope so too.
All
It's
right,
great to talk
everybody,
to you.
you've been listening to It's All About Food. Thank you for joining me. Buy the book. Have a delicious week. Bye.